everyone. I'm Deb Wallace, the Executive Director of Knowledge and Library Services here at Harvard Business School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our third virtual Books at Baker session. For those of you who are new to this series, it started out as an opportunity for Harvard Business School staff and students to get under the hood of our faculty's research, to learn how the research process unfolds, and with a focus on what that publication looks like, what the book looks like at the end. And in addition to learning more about that process, we also had the opportunity to gain new knowledge based on our faculty's finding, with the hope that we can apply their new knowledge to our own practice. And while I certainly miss welcoming you to an Aldridge classroom on the HBS campus, moving this series online has enabled us to reach beyond our physical space and have our colleagues in the global research centers, students scattered around the world, and a large number of alumni, practitioners, and other people interested in these topics. So thank you for joining us. But before we turn to our speakers, a quick note on how the session will unfold. John and Joe are going to talk about their research for about 20 minutes, but then we want to move fairly quickly into hearing from you. So any questions that you have, you can start putting into the chat function at any time. And then what we'll do is we'll call questions from that chat, and we'll get to as many of those as possible before we wrap up at 4:30. It's my very great pleasure to introduce you to John Mccomber, who is a senior lecturer in finance here at HBS, and whom I usually get to see on a regular basis, given that his office is on the ground floor on Baker Libraries. So I miss seeing you, John. John studies the future of cities in both the developing and emerging worlds, and has written over 30 cases on infrastructure projects around the world. Also joining us is Joe Allen, who is the director of the Healthy Buildings Program and an associate professor at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Joe is the creator of the 9 Foundations of a Healthy Building and advises leading companies around the world on strategies to build and maintain these safe environments. So needless to say, their work and their recent publication, Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity, is a timely topic as so many parts of our world begin to return to work. So please join me in welcoming John and Joe to Books at Baker.
Thank you, Deb. We're delighted to be here, and I indeed am sorry not to be able to see you and everybody else at HBS on a beautiful June day like this. So we'd like to talk to you a little bit about the original research behind this book and some of the things that we discovered around human cognition, and then move on to, okay, what now? What happens in the time of post-COVID or returning from COVID? Because a lot of people are interested in that as well. So let me talk a little bit about that, and then we'll be happy to take questions in both segments. So with respect to the sort of part one of our conversation today about the book and the findings before COVID-19, it became very clear from leading architects and real estate developers and facility managers and library people and hospitals all over the world, we needed another generation of design ideas that were based on the people in the structures, not just the structures. So our idea was to look at buildings and business and health and ultimately make it cost-effective look at wealth. So the question, of course, that we started to think about is, why are we ignoring the 90%? And I'd like to introduce my colleague and collaborator, Joe Allen, to talk about the 90%.
Thanks, John. Yes, this is great to be here with you all. And thanks, Deb, for setting this up and letting us talk about this book and really talk about COVID and beyond COVID in this time when maybe for the first time in history, the entire world is realizing just how important the indoor environment is to our health. So let's start with this question, which we pose in the book and we've been talking about for a while in our presentations. Why are we ignoring the 90%? Well, here's what that means. We spend 90% of our time indoors. We are an indoor species. And John, if you move to the next slide, you see this breakdown here. You see we spend all this time indoors. We spend most of our time thinking about and focusing on and even have national protections for that 10% of where we spend our time. It's critically important, of course, but the indoor environment is having this massive impact on our health. One way to think about this is to take this in terms of your age. So take your age, multiply it by 0.9. That's how many years you've lived indoors. So if we were all together in person, I would call on somebody. This is really horrible to do in person because it's public math and nobody likes to disclose their age. But you say, all right, I'll do it myself. I'm 44 years old. I spent 40 years of my life indoors. My indoor age is 40. When we think about it that way, put it in terms of years, it becomes really obvious and quite intuitive that the indoor environment has this massive impact on our health. Yet our understanding or how much we study this is small relative to these other areas we study or knowledge about our health. If I ask people, what does it take to lead a healthy lifestyle? Everyone would rattle off the same things. Oh, I have to exercise. Yeah, I know what a healthy lunch looks like. Very few would turn towards the indoor environment. That's because it's largely understudied relative to these other aspects of healthy living. But a study we published just a couple of years ago started to look at these other benefits or impacts of the indoor environment, specifically on cognitive function and decision-making performance as a proxy or an indicator for worker productivity. Here's a study we did we call the Cog Effect Study for cognitive function. Really quite simple in design, but sophisticated in terms of the methodology and the controls put in place. We had knowledge workers come into this kind of ugly cubicle farm you see pictured there. What they didn't know was that from the floor below, we were changing the air they were breathing in really subtle ways. And at the end of the day, we administered a cognitive function test. And what we found were really quite dramatic results. Just manipulating 3 variables, ventilation, chemicals in the air, called VOCs, and carbon dioxide, we saw dramatic improvements to cognitive function test scores across 9 cognitive function domains that are indicators or tell us about decision-making performance. Specifically, cognitive function domains like crisis response, information seeking and information usage, and also overall strategy. So clearly domains that are relevant for the knowledge economy. How this shapes into a bigger picture of what else does it mean to have a healthy building, we released this report we call the 9 Foundations of a Healthy Building. Really, there's a lot of information like that study I mentioned, and now we're in our 3rd iteration of that Cog Effect study. It's now global. But there's a whole host of data, and I mean 40 years of data that's sitting on the sidelines that should be leveraged, that tells you what you should do in your building, and also why it matters to human health, and also what that means towards for your business. And that's what we try to do in this book. We have an entire chapter dedicated to the 9 foundations, explaining the science. We think we do it in an accessible format, but really then giving tips. So now you have the knowledge. Well, what do you do? And for each of the foundations, we offer some tips on how you might think about that.
So from there, we thought, how can we bring some of this to practice? How can we make this information really useful to people who spend time in schools and apartment buildings and stores and offices and laboratories and workplaces? So we thought about these, what we call the 10 global mega changes shaping the world and shaping our buildings and therefore shaping us. And we won't go through all this now, but we can cover this certainly in the questions if you want. One is changing populations combined with changing cities. That's what I study, is massive urbanization as hundreds of millions of people move to cities all over the world seeking opportunity. There's also changing resources, not enough clean air, not enough clean water, changing climate, and a changing role of the private sector, particularly as the public sector has less and less money to pay for things. And now post-COVID, that will be even more the case. You also think about the changing definition of health, and that has happened in spades in the last 3 or 4 months as people become much more aware of pandemics and other viruses that can travel through. We think about changing buildings, about green buildings, healthy buildings, and changing work. And work was becoming more and more knowledge work and office work anyway, and now that's been put under pressure by the work from home movement, at least for knowledge workers in the developed world. You think about changing technology, notably the kind of things we can do both to clean our air and also to measure the air and the other conditions of the spaces in which we live, and finally changing values, whether this is about reimagining capitalism and thinking about how corporations are working more and more to try and be responsible citizens, or now thinking about values with respect to race, public health, all those manifestations that kind of come together in the built environment. So part of what we conclude is that in many ways, having a healthy building is no longer a luxury or a nice to have, it's a must have, it's the new minimum. So our work for urban land has talked about tenants and investors in commercial real estate, which I teach will be looking for healthy buildings. The case study that Joe and I published together is called The Tower for the People. It's about a new building on Park Avenue, New York, 425 Park Avenue, which is claimed to be the healthiest building in New York, one of the healthiest buildings in the world, the first building to be well certified. So the idea here is that this is what people are going to be asking for. We can talk more about that case study if you like. It's also the subject of a cold call podcast. Let's move into the second part. And of course, we're happy to answer questions about the book, and it is part of the Books at Baker methodology, but a lot of you are on today thinking about, okay, what can we do going forward? Should also mention that Joe and I are doing a couple other podcasts this week and next week, specifically one for commercial real estate with the Crimson Connection, which is a number of HBS real estate alumni, and another one with the Society for College and University Planners next Tuesday. And we can give you those details if you'd like to know more. We think right now there's more of a general interest audience, however. So let's talk about some of the ways to measure risk as we go back to our buildings, because there's all this talk about opening this up, opening that up. That's essentially opening up supply of buildings. Will there be a demand? Will you and I feel safe going to restaurants, going to conventions, going to rock shows, going to the supermarket, those kind of things? So that's what some of our work has been like going forward. And Joe has been prominent in leading our publications in this regard.
Yes, when we think about this COVID world we're in, you know, certainly none of us knew this virus at this time would hit and cause this pandemic, but everyone in public health, and many others, of course, knew that a pandemic was going to happen. And we narrowly avoided the first SARS and MERS, two other coronaviruses, H5N1, H1N1, other influenza viruses. But here we find ourselves, you know, in the middle of this pandemic. And one of the first pieces I wrote, this is in the New York Times in early March. I actually wrote a piece in Financial Times in early February saying that buildings should be the first line of defense against this novel coronavirus, because there are strategies we can put in place right now to minimize risk, right? There's no such thing as zero risk. And we have to think about these healthy building strategies in a larger risk reduction framework. So in addition to running the Healthy Buildings program at Harvard School of Public Health, my background is really exposure and risk science, worker health and safety. I'm a certified industrial hygienist. This is the field that anticipates hazards and controls hazards. And in my field, we use what's called the hierarchy of controls. John and I wrote about this in an article in Harvard Business Review. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago it came out, where we introduced the hierarchy in the context of COVID-19. So it only has 5 parts. Just really quickly, ideally you eliminate the hazard. That's work from home strategies, but that's not the path to restarting the economy. Then can you substitute the hazard? Bring just the core people back. Engineering controls. These are fundamentally healthy building strategies. Higher ventilation, more filtration. Then administrative controls, really de-densification strategies. How do you handle flows of people and choreograph people through elevators and lobbies and things like that? And fifth is PPE, for personal protective equipment. And this is the use of masks, universal mask wearing, really. And so this framework has been a way to help understand a lot of that complex science and distill it down and make sense of it and get it into these nice little buckets here. As we're talking to many of these organizations around the world, it's clear that you know, everyone's focus is on coronavirus right now, as it should be. People are also starting to ask, well, what's next, and how are expectations shifting? And in the book, we talk about this idea that, not this idea of tell people about what's really happening, is that people are interviewing their building. And maybe you're familiar with the website Glassdoor, where people do report on things you would expect: salary, boss, title. They're also reporting on the building. And we give examples in the book. You know, it smells bad in here. The temperature's bad. I can't concentrate. I see rats. And so these are things that are public, and people are evaluating their building. And we put up a couple examples here that this continues in the COVID era, as you might expect. Here's a good example and a bad example. In the bad example, someone is saying, how is this different from being stuck on a cruise ship? And the other one praised the leadership of their firm. This information is real, and it will live forever. And you can imagine trying to recruit the next top talent to your organization. And if they see this, it's going to influence their decision on whether or not they come work for you.
So as we started to think about whether people are going to come work for you, we wrote a piece for Working Knowledge together about who guarantees that your workplace is safe for return. Because the short answer is nobody guarantees your workplace is safe for return. There's no health agency inspecting Morgan Hall or Shad. There's no, if you're going to the old Hancock building downtown, does the landlord say your space is safe? Does the tenant say you're safe? If you're working in a meatpacking plant, who do you believe that says that it's safe? And we thought there's going to be a lot of ways in which people have to assess this. And there's going to be lots of sort of safe harbor, you know, prudent person kind of thoughts about how can you at least show that you thought about seeing that the workplace was safe from the point of view who the occupants are going to be. So a lot of this was originally thought about in our book in terms of taking the pulse of the building. So you can take the pulse of a building and of the people in it the way that a doctor would do of a person. So you can think about a number of health performance indicators, and we think that these are just as important as key performance indicators, and a lot of you do OKRs with objectives, key performance indicators, and results. So let's think about what's happening in this space, and is the space safe for return? So some of the direct indicators measure the employees, like what's your temperature, what's your blood pressure, do you have the antibodies? Some of them also measure the building. What is the fan speed set for? What's the humidity? Some of these are leading indicators, meaning ahead of the fact. So for example, what is your temperature now, or what is your attitude about how scared you are to go to work? Some are lagging indicators, like how many sick days were there, how many people missed time, how many people had to go back after a second surge. Similarly, in the building, some are leading indicators, like what are the settings for the filters and fans, and some are trailing indicators, like what is the observed particulate concentration or VOCs. So our premise is that there's really a menu of 5 things that go with the hierarchy of controls that individuals or or tenant companies or landlords or universities or hospitals or processing plants or airports can all use to measure these impacts and show that, yes, indeed, we are running a healthier operation here. So the health performance indicators essentially show that what gets measured gets done, and these can be looked at across the time series. So one is simple settings, like what are the settings for how many air changes you're going to get? What are the filtration requirements in the building? Are they actually being done? And if you ask Joe about this in the questions, he'll point out that most of the standards are minimums. They're not optimums, and particularly the coronavirus. In indoor spaces, it's quite dangerous, but the presence of the coronavirus correlates to the presence or absence of ventilation. So ventilation and filtration matter a lot. Second is around sensors, around air quality. And there's an interesting phenomenon here where maybe the landlord is checking everybody at the door with some kind of heat sensor, or maybe individuals are using their own air quality monitors to share this information in a democratic way. Screening you read about a lot, temperatures taken a lot, the people in the White House get their antibodies tested. A lot of this will happen as people come back to work and come back to school. Surveys matter as well around what the experience is, and particularly around human behaviors. So in an academic setting, there's a lot of concern that students won't necessarily perfectly socially distance. I don't want to talk to you about the fraternity I was in, but a way to find out if this is happening, or even if your coworkers are coming in and respecting your space in the elevator or not sneezing on you or wearing a mask, can be determined in proper surveys. And finally, statistics. So the most common use of statistics that you see now, the most reliable one is around excess deaths. So you can also look at excess sick days after people return or other criteria like that. So what we tried to do is to go through and talk about a number of the ways in which we set about doing this research, why we thought there was a real business case for healthy buildings to make sense to lots of people. And then as it happened, this horrible scourge came upon the planet, and we think we'll be able to help influence practice a little bit in that regard as well. So we're kind of sorry we have to do work around the coronavirus, but hope it can be helpful. And we're happy to take questions about how the book came about how our collaboration came about at 2 Harvard schools, or other questions the audience may have. So thank you, and Deb, I will turn the floor back to you.
Great, thank you. We've got a nice queue of questions forming in chat, so please go ahead and put them in. But to give you a few minutes to do that, let me start off and pick up on the question, or the point that you made, John. Is it, President Faust, a number of years, well, probably more than a decade ago, championed the One Harvard movement, and so we've seen lots of collaboration across various schools, bringing faculty together from different disciplines, coming at a topic as the two of you have from 2 perspectives. So maybe you could tell us a little bit, how did you find each other?
So I went to a dinner at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and I met this guy, Joe Allen, and he showed the COG-FX study. And Joe, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I think we had this kind of kinship. We're both teaching in related fields around real estate, sustainable development. We both had worked in private practice, so I think we thought alike. And I think we saw this real need, and we actually talk about in the book in terms of hand waving, right, in our respective fields. So I'm in health science, and we turn it into some economic argument, but it's a little hand wavy. And I think John would say the same. They're talking deep in the finance in these case studies, and maybe the health stuff had been a little hand wavy. And we decided to start merging this a bit. So I started lecturing in John's class at the business school, bringing some of that health science and engaging the business students on that side. And John would come to my class at the School of Public Health and start talking to the health students around the business aspect of these decisions.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Well, as I said, we have quite a number of questions, and not surprising, the first one is really around air quality. And so can you talk a little bit more about, there's a number in here talking about the air quality issues, keeping windows open. You know, we live in these hermetically sealed buildings. What happens when toilets flush and everything's pushed up into the air, which are, writer says, which nobody wants to talk about, and how often should this air change? What can you tell us without maybe going too technical, but
Sure.
we're ready for it.
Yeah, no, let's talk about where we are. We're really in the sick building era and why we got there, and these questions hint at it. In the 1970s, in response to the energy crisis, we started tightening up our building envelopes and we stopped letting them breathe. And it brought on the era of sick buildings, right? We're not diluting the indoor contaminants. Indoor contaminants can be 3, 5, 10 times higher than outdoors. I think that surprises a lot of people. What people be interested to know is that before that era, we used to set ventilation standards based on infectious disease, keeping people healthy. So we've lost our way a bit there. And we talk about this in the book about how we've lost our way. And we think, hopefully, give a roadmap for how we can find our way again by prioritizing buildings that are designed for people, really human-centric design.
Yeah. So who in the field is helping us think through? What are the architects doing? What are the builders, the design consultants, academic leaders? What are they doing? You're talking about it, and you've highlighted a whole number of things we could be thinking about. How is this being implemented?
Do you want to talk about the pre-COVID time or the post-COVID time?
How many buildings have been built during COVID? I think construction kind of came to a standstill.
There's a lot of retrofitting, that's right.
Yeah.
So the premise of the book to start with is that we're not making good real estate investments. Basically, we're not making good physical plant investments. We're not making good investments in our hospitals or schools because we're being short-sighted. As Joe said, we're thinking really hard about these green buildings that save energy, which is important, but you wind up having these different pockets of responsibility. So there might be somebody in a big university who gets a pat in the back for saving 2 cents on electricity and saving a little more money because they stretched the filters a little bit longer, but they're missing the big picture, which is that humans are not performing as well, because there's too much CO2 in their space, too many particulates. And part of what we track through in the book is the economic impact of that. Particularly, we took the hardest situation, which is commercial real estate, where you also have this conflict between landlord and tenants and who's going to pay for what. And walk through a typical knowledge work company like a law firm or a consulting firm, for whom, if you look at their entire income statement, about half of that is salaries, maybe about 20 or 30% is rent, maybe 5% is energy. So if you save 10% of 5%, it's a tiny little bit. But if people can perform slightly better, like be sick 2 fewer days per year, or maybe you make 1 extra sales call and close another deal, that affects the bottom line directly because it's about revenue and about cost. So we started tracking that through just around the cognition pieces and the avoided cost, essentially, of not providing people the best environment that they could have to try and be the most productive they could be. Now in the post-COVID time, the downside of a sick building is much more apparent, particularly when you look at some of the living conditions in some of the places that have been hit the worst in the United States and in the world, notably in New York and Brooklyn and in Queens, where people live close together in poorly ventilated spaces and are forced to ride public transportation because they have to get to these jobs. So there's disproportionate illness and a very disproportionate cost. So now we think that the avoided cost of those future days of illness is going to make the case even more. So the question then becomes for us around propagation: is this just a fancy thing for a fancy building on Park Avenue with a fancy landlord, or will it propagate out to the rest of the world? And we think eventually it will, in the same way that air conditioning, rubber roofs, elevators, green buildings eventually propagated out to the rest of the world. And ultimately, It'll be a requirement, particularly if you think going forward, if you're worried about the economic conditions and recession. In time of recession, a tenant or occupier or apartment renter who can pay the rent or make the mortgage will be able to kind of write their own ticket, because they'll have that kind of negotiating power, and they'll require a building that's healthy, and they'll have the tools in their hands to know if the building is healthy or not.
Yeah, I never thought about interviewing a building. You know, when you think about going for a job and you're interviewing the organization, I truthfully never thought about the building in which I'm working. But there was a question that I think follows on what you're talking about, John, is that are these safe buildings going to be too expensive? Or how do we change that conversation where they're not looking at what the cost of the building is, but what the revenue of the productivity and the the healthiness of the staff? But there's one of our participants said, what are we going to do in order to ensure that the least economically disadvantaged areas have access to these healthy buildings?
So there's two parts to that question. First, let's talk about, is it too expensive? And I'll throw that back to Joe, because we've both done a lot of work around the capital costs and operating costs for a more healthy building. And then maybe Joe can reiterate some of the hierarchy of controls and the relative expense that those have. So a lot of the things that need to be done aren't that expensive.
Yeah,
Joe,
on that first part of that question, yeah, it's a misnomer that healthy buildings are expensive buildings. It's also a misnomer that only the shiny new buildings can be healthy buildings. I spent a decade doing forensic investigations of sick buildings. I've seen the worst of the worst: radiological hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards in schools, offices, homes. And in each one of those, we were able to turn an unhealthy building into a healthy building just with a little bit of attention. The problem is we're just not putting that attention onto it and thinking about these benefits that accrue enterprise-wide. So if you're making this decision, you say, well, that's going to cost me a couple dollars here. Very often that decision is not saying, well, the benefit is going to be multiples just in different pockets of the company. So that's been a real barrier to adoption. In terms of COVID-19, the same logic applies. Since February, I've been writing frequently in major newspapers, HBR with John, talking about these healthy building strategies that can minimize risk, and intentionally talking about strategies that are not expensive and nearly every single building can do. Run the fans a bit more, bring in more fresh outdoor air, a little bit higher filtration, put in these administrative controls, use that hierarchy of control strategies. You'll notice in these pieces, I'm not talking about fancy, UV technology, upper room UV, air cleaning technology, things that require capital improvements. It's a time for the basics, just like, wash your hands, keep away. It's time for the basics in public health. And for healthy buildings, the same thing applies, the real basics here, and it doesn't have to be expensive.
Yeah. There's also so much a comment about social distancing, and we're certainly seeing this as Boston is coming back in phase 2, and in the streets in front of restaurants now have seats outside, all socially distanced, and the whole notion of let's move everything outside. So do you think this is a whole resurgence? Maybe in New England might be a little bit of challenge for 12 months of the year, but do you see us becoming less 90% indoors and more outdoors?
I don't necessarily think so in terms of places like New England, right? But let's think about the indoor and outdoor, and thinking about reconnecting with nature in a couple of, we talk about the benefits of biophilic design indoors, bringing nature back indoors. Bringing more fresh outdoor air indoors is bringing nature indoors, increasing that ventilation. Now we're not outside, but the idea is we're getting away from these minimum standards for ventilation or outdoor air brought in that were set by engineers, not by public health scientists. The standard for ventilation, you'll be surprised to know, is called the Standard for Acceptable Indoor Air Quality. The problem is right in the name. It's a standard for acceptable indoor air quality. If I designed it, or my team designed it, or people at schools of public health designed it, it'd be the standard for healthy indoor air quality. And it'd be a lot higher ventilation rates than we're currently doing for buildings right now. The second problem is that once we design to these minimum standards, very often we forget about it, right? They're not a performance-based standard. So you might design on day one, the building might meet these minimum standards, and then years later, the performance is decreasing, despite 40 years of scientific evidence that show benefits to higher ventilation rates, including the cognitive function piece, reductions in infectious disease transmission, reductions in worker absenteeism. So the benefits are many. It's not quite spending time outside, but yeah, we definitely do need to bring some of that outside back into our buildings.
Yeah, yeah. So with the social distancing, and all of the questions about returning to work, as many people have put in here, is what do you see happening? Is this going to be a starting point where everything has the 6 to 9 feet apart and then will decline or go all the way? Like, how do you see the interiors of our buildings evolving over the next 6, 8, 9, 12 months?
So I can answer maybe with a longer time frame, and Joe can answer about a shorter time frame. So there are two really big unknowns in this situation. One is around how long COVID will be rampaging through us. There's no vaccine or cure. As far as I know, there's never been a vaccine discovered for any of the 7 major coronaviruses that circulate. So will it be with us forever? Like dengue, something you can get twice, something that's really dangerous? Or will we somehow bottle it up in 18 or 24 months and say, oh, I'm glad we got, or everybody's herd immune or something like that? And the other is sort of indirectly around the cost of energy. So right now, oil is at a historic low, about $40 a barrel, Brent crude this week. Many nations need $70 or $80 to match their budgets. So that means a couple things. One is the price of oil depends in part on demand. So if the price of oil stays down, it means economic activity is slow. It also means that driving is cheap. So if you think of the scenario where COVID was with us for a long time and driving is cheap, that would put pressure or put opportunity for less deeply densified downtown areas with 100-story buildings, and might mean more for 4- and 5-story buildings in the suburbs, or cities with multiple different nodes working together. On the other hand, if it turns out, nobody knows, if it turns out that we figure out something about COVID in the next few months and oil gets expensive again, then people are social people that like being dense, and that would mean that sort of back to normal. It's not 100% sure that we're going to go back to normal ever. So it's important for building owners and so university people and hospitals to think there might be a situation where COVID's here for a long time. So nobody knows. It's not realistic any more than a good investor would make a giant one-way bet on interest rates or stock market or exchange rates. We don't think it's prudent to make a big one-way bet on the economy and on COVID, on the energy prices related. So you kind of have to think that way, and before knowing if this is a permanent thing, we're going to be separated 9 feet forever, or if these are all just temporary plastic things which we then rip apart in 8 months and I guess throw in the ocean. So what do you think about the near future for offices and schools?
Well, so, I've been advising companies and organizations across, it's healthcare, universities, commercial real estate, courts, prisons, homeless shelters, you name it. And we're going to see changes in all of those places, and theaters. In fact, the Harvard's American Repertory Theater. We're going to see changes in the short term, absolutely. And we should, right? The office should look different when we go back right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. I do hope that some of these changes will be permanent. Certainly not the plexiglass barriers and things like this, but some of these changes we're making that we know are good for our health, even beyond COVID. We're talking a lot about ventilation, filtration, but some of these other practices that are just good, healthy building practice that we talked about that don't actually cost that much. What I think will also transition in the, coming out of COVID or whenever that is, that the expectations of people will change. So when people go back to work right now, they'll be thinking about their doorknob, the elevator, right? COVID will be on the mind. Infectious disease will be on their mind. It should and will quickly change into, well, what else is influencing my health in this building? Or how is this building influencing my health? What about acoustics? What about lighting? What about biophilic design, as we mentioned, and these other factors? The health, the material choices we're making in terms of the products in our buildings. We have an entire chapter dedicated to this. So I think quickly people will start asking these other questions and demand better from their buildings, as they should.
There was a question also about, do you think the progress that we've made against materials, antibacterial materials and chemically modified materials, have we lost ground on not having those in buildings? Will people feel like, we have to have hand sanitizers and surfaces that clean themselves, et cetera?
Yeah,
Right, and single-use serving utensils and
Single-use,
plastics and
right,
things like that,
right.
Joe, would be part of that too.
yeah. You know, on the antimicrobials, it might get into too much depth, but that's fine. We talk about antimicrobials in the book, but you know, some of these antimicrobials interfere with our hormone system. They interfere with our reproductive system and our reproductive hormones. So they're important, and then we've been phasing them out, including some great work at Harvard, led by, I'm a faculty advisor to Harvard's Healthier Building Materials Academy, led by Heather Henriksen in the Office for Sustainability. I don't see those coming back. Why? Because the evidence is clear that they don't provide an infectious disease benefit. We can't go around coding everything in antimicrobials.
Yeah.
There are better strategies. Hand washing is a better strategy. Cleaning, disinfecting, high-touch services during a pandemic is a better strategy. I think we have to be a lot smarter about all the material choices we make, including VOCs. We talk about SVOCs in our book, semi-volatile compounds, these chemicals that off-gas slowly from products, the chairs we're sitting in, our carpets, our furniture. These antimicrobials are wrapped up in that. You know, the majority of us have these hormone disrupting chemicals in our body. 98% of Americans have these in our body. They're coming from materials we use indoors in our buildings and homes. So that's it's a lengthy conversation. We dedicate the whole chapter of the book to it, but it is tied into the COVID conversation too, as you kind of feel some of these pressures and people say, well, yeah, at first glance, it makes sense. Cover everything in antimicrobials, right? But if we think about it a little harder, we realize, wait, there's a secondary harm we're creating if these things interfere with our hormones. Do they work? That evidence suggests it doesn't. They do not work. So we have to factor in these things and not make too many rash decisions right now, and really go back to the science when we're making decisions about really what is going to work in terms of COVID and beyond COVID. So we're not making these decisions that are really not grounded in solid science.
Yeah.
But you also get questions around these various technologies that are natural for techno people and engineers and venture investors and all that. Is there some kind of techno fix when almost everything that Joe has talked about is about behavior?
Yeah.
And so whether it's the hierarchy controls, your own behavior distancing, it's actually a lot like a number of other things that are in a related area of sustainability and energy efficiency, is that what trumps all these gadgets and gizmos and venture investable intellectual property protectable things is human behavior.
Yeah.
And we're not going to code everything in antimicrobial stuff, nor are we all going to stay home forever. But you can manage your exposure budget in a way that you can think, okay, since the risk of infection has to do with the intensity of the virus near me and the duration of time and the proximity to people, you have a budget, and it's safer to go to the grocery store than it is to go to a bar. So you can manage those kind of things from a behavior point of view as well. And both of us think that ultimately is going to be the driver much more than spending a whole bunch of money that doesn't exist on these various high-tech things.
Yeah, I noticed, or you said earlier, you were calling a safe harbor and prudent people. So it could be, you know, we could do everything with the building. We could put in every kind of safety feature we could do, but it's people's behavior that in the end, you know, I look at pictures of the opening of beaches and, you know, the mass population, the people on, and they're not social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're not, how are we going to convince people that there are some precautions we should be taking? Can the building help us do that?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question and comment, right? The only way through this is with a high degree of social trust. Certainly owners have responsibilities and they'll manage their building. Tenants have responsibilities, and then also people have to take their own responsibilities here in terms of their personal behavior change. That said, you know, we have a responsibility when we roll out any public health intervention, to train and educate people on why it's needed and how to do it correctly. And in some instances, we've done really well. So take hand
Also
washing.
the balancing of risk, Joe, and you talk a lot about the balancing of risk and what's cost effective. So you're not out dictating what, you know, how you'd wrap yourself hermetically and put yourself away for 6 months. You're always talking about the balance of risk and the cost benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my professor title is a professor of exposure assessment science. It's all about exposure and risk. I'm a believer we can reopen the economy safely. Like I said, any building I've seen, there are ways to put in these controls. So I know we can reopen safely. Why? Because we've done it many times for many different buildings with similar high stakes, right? We know how to put these controls in place. Sometimes what happens though is we put in these, you know, plans, but then we don't educate on how to roll these things out. right? So it's talking about hand washing there. Well, now we all know how to wash. We've all seen that video. We need the same kind of education that says, well, put in these healthy building, 9 foundations of a healthy building. Okay, we need to then educate people. What does that mean? How do you do it right? And then to John's point, this verification, which we wrote about, you can use new sensor technologies to kind of verify performance. Okay, I put in these controls. Let me look at the data in real time indoor air quality monitors, interpret that data against health-based benchmarks, so these HPIs, health performance indicators, and then you'll know how you're performing, and you can catch things before they're a problem, right? Before many people get sick, or you have a run of people who are going out, even in a post-COVID world, due to sickness and absenteeism. So that's how you have to keep the pulse of the building, so you can stay on top of these changes and catch them early. And we can reopen safely if we do all of that.
Do you think, is there a role for certification? You know, I'm thinking about the green leaf, the gold buildings, et cetera, that, you know, we've gone through all this around the green building. Do you see a healthy building certificate?
You want to take that, John? Okay, sure. Yeah. So we actually, again, we have a chapter on this because we think there's a lot of interest here. Many people are familiar with the green building rating systems, like you mentioned. You've probably seen a plaque on your building. It's LEED Gold for the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED certification, or LEED Platinum. Harvard has over 100 LEED buildings on campus. Those are largely focused on energy, waste, and water. And it's natural that an extension of that energy-focused rating systems are new health-based rating systems. We talk about several of the leading the current leaders as terms of rating systems. We think there is an interest. There's certainly an interest in the market for this. And John and I, we're not in the place here picking winners and losers. We actually think this space is going to evolve really quickly. But we end the chapter by laying out the things we think any good certification should have. So rather than kind of pick each one apart or find the good and the bad, we just say, look, they have to be objective. They have to be grounded in the latest science. It has to be verifiable, and also it has to be completely objective, right? Where we're not, it's one building does this does this. It has to be based on the hard science, and it has to be, you have to be able to measure it using these HPIs, and then we can talk about this as being real health, and it also can't be a one-in-time stamp. Yeah. So for example, the building I'm in at Harvard is a LEED, maybe a gold building. There's a plaque on the wall. It's at least a dozen years old. Does that building perform like it did 12 years ago? Absolutely not. There's no way. Now imagine we do that for health. Imagine we stamp our buildings with a one-time plaque that says this building was healthy as of June 2020. And that 5 years later, there's no way that building is performing like it did. So that these health certification has to be constantly updated and verified. And here's the last thought on these certifications. If we get green building certifications wrong, we screw up the energy analysis. Okay, if you get a healthy building certification wrong and you screw that up, people's lives are on the line. It's really different. It's really different, and it has to be taken a lot more seriously.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's another aspect of this assessment or measurement that will come into play that hasn't been in play before. So the question about a building certification assumes that there's some wise body outside certifying these things essentially with the building owner, facilities manager, landlord, somebody like that. Very top-down situation. And even thinking about indoor air quality, it wasn't very long ago that if you want to measure indoor air quality, you had to get a hygienist to bring out a big bottle and take it back to the lab, and then a week later the results would come and they'd be secret. Well, now anybody can buy an air quality monitor inexpensively, plug it into their iPhone, and share that data with whoever they want. So our apartment renters, people working in meatpacking places, people riding on the subway can measure not COVID yet, but good proxies for it around ventilation, around particulates, around volatile organic compounds, and share that. And so we're in a situation where the democratization of that building quality can be out there. I think Joe mentioned Glassdoor before, but if you think about people measuring, rating restaurants or other facilities on Yelp or Open Door, or some people rate professors. So there's that kind of democratization of that. There's a real ability of people to do that, and we think that will manifest in a couple of ways. One is that with the elite kind of knowledge workers who are interviewing their building, they may not want to work for this bank, they might want to work for that bank. Or in particular, they might not want to rent from this landlord or that landlord. If you extend that to the emerging world where the outdoor air quality isn't necessarily that great, Then you have the situation where particularly people renting apartments can validate in real time the claim that somebody made that this apartment has clean air because they can measure it themselves. And they can share that information with other people outside. So the question of whether that information gets collected and goes in the cloud and is used in a democratized way for users to give real-time feedback on their buildings, or whether it's collected by a large landlord who can aggregate 100,000 units, or whether it's collected by some scary big brother, is still very much up in the air,
right,
as it were.
right. There are quite a number of questions, and I don't want to put you on the spot on this one, but why not? We'll try. There are a lot of questions about our understanding of the virus, and can it actually travel through air conditioning or heating systems, and what's the impact of humidity? Are those things that you've seen much study of yet?
Yeah, I'm glad it was asked, actually. So people in my field have been, and I've been writing about this, it seems like every week or every 2 weeks since February, that airborne transmission is happening. If you look at what CDC and WHO say, though, they say there's 3 modes of transmission. Let's start there. Large droplet, contaminated surfaces, or what we call fomites, and airborne. CDC and WHO are saying the first 2 are happening, large droplet and maybe some from contaminated surfaces. They have not been saying airborne. The evidence is really clear from an aerosol physics standpoint. If you look at these case studies, I could talk about the choir practice. Yeah. It's really our own modeling shows that airborne is happening. It makes a lot of sense, and we have to put in these control strategies. So my field is really perplexed. That's why this is not being recognized by the CDC. I think that'll change soon. I hope it changes soon. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago saying airborne transmission is happening. I laid out the evidence, and I also tied it to the evidence of this super spreaders. We have to try to minimize these large gatherings where people can spread it to many people. Airborne transmission is part of this. It's nothing to be scared about. We just have to recognize this happening. Then we apply the relevant healthy building control strategies.
Yeah. And there's another question that I think falls pretty close to all of us, that as many of us are working remotely, what are some of the things we can do in our own home to ensure that our home, I mean, we've been talking about healthy buildings, as big structures, but what about our homes where we're living, whether it's an apartment building or a standalone home? Are there some simple things or things that we should be aware of that we can do as we're working from home?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll answer, and then John can chime in too. We're in part of this gigantic experiment where the whole world said, everyone go work from home, but without the responsibilities that organizations normally have to keep people healthy in their buildings, including ergonomics or the chairs they're on. We send people home and maybe don't even have a place to do work, a desk or a computer to work from home, or a monitor, people working on their couch with roommates. So we're in this funny spot right now, and I'm glad that question's asked, because I think organizations have a massive responsibility and duty right now to make sure if you tell people work from home, that you supply them with what they need to have a healthy work environment home. That goes beyond ergonomics and computers, but start to think about these other strategies you mentioned. My Healthy Buildings program at Harvard has a program we call Homes for Health. So if people want to look at that, you can Google it, it's at homes.forhealth.org. And it's 36 expert tips for how to keep your home a little bit healthier. And we talk about these other things that are beyond COVID and beyond infectious disease. I'll also say I wrote a piece early on in March on what to do if someone in your home has coronavirus. Oh. So I'd encourage people to look at that. I think it was in USA Today, but it gives you tips for what to do in your home in the case someone is sick, so you can try to limit within-home transmission. All of those resources, by the way, are on our Healthy Buildings site at forhealth.org, forhealth.org.
John, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, for the work from home question, I don't really have a further comment about how to be safer working at home, except to point out that there's only a small population who can do that. Maybe everybody on this call is people from Harvard or Boston, or knowledge workers who have a home and have an office and have a knowledge worker kind of job and have bandwidth and have a computer. But in the United States, that disqualifies meatpacking people, people driving the buses, people doing all the cleaning for you, people coming in, cooking your food, going to restaurants, all these kind of things. And it also disqualifies most of the population of the world who don't have a job that can be done at home and may not have a sanitary condition at home. Or if you say to them, wash your hands for 20 seconds, they say, I'm buying water for $1 a gallon off a truck. I'm not going to use it to wash my hands. So it's a little, it's interesting for us and for the economy if you scale it sort of by jobs and their contribution to GDP, but in terms of what's the eventual fix going forward doesn't help as much. And so the ability to help these all these other populations practice the basic hygiene I'd like to practice matters quite a bit. And there's ways to think about paying for that too that are interesting to us, because a lot of what we talk about in the book is around the cost-benefit analysis. Essentially, in the book, we talk about pre-COVID for office workers, the benefit of the avoided future cost of being sick, and the benefit of future being maybe more productive, and that's worth investing in upfront. That's a kind of, we show it with the COG-FX study, but when you think about many populations and the very huge cost to society of these illnesses, and the direct hospitalizations for people not hospitalized who die, now the avoided cost, or the upcoming event is much more expensive. Therefore, in theory, cities themselves should be able to say, you know, we should spend more money on cleaning these toilets, or on public health, or on air conditioning in buildings, or in fixing these elevators that are broken in these projects, because it's going to have a clear payoff from people not having this horrible disease. So in the abstract, you can think about the HBS cliche of how are we going to create shared value? How are we going to create value, realize value, and capture value? And if you look at the avoided cost of a lot of these illnesses, there should be an argument for how do we create value and share it and invest up front, whether it's by a city or whether it's by a private investor. Sort of in the same idea as when we used to do energy efficiency finance, but with a much higher payback.
Yeah. There's also a question, and we talked a little bit about this as we were planning the session, and you hit on it, John, about, you know, the de-densification of city centers and people moving out and where they could, et cetera. And then we have companies that are also saying we're not going to bring people back at all. We're going to stay totally remote. So again, I know it's a little crystal ball gazing, but how do you see the relationship between an organization and its employees changing significantly?
Well, that probably has a little bit to do with the prior scenario around COVID and energy, but there's not much question that people have figured out how to do Zoominars a lot faster than they were going to. And in higher education, and for example, libraries, there's certainly no question that the genie is not going back in the bottle. And if you talk to any healthcare professional around Boston, they'll say that telehealth is here probably 5 or 10 or 20 years earlier than it was going to be. Those things won't change. There also is probably going to be a pretty big recession. You know, people all say, oh, it's going to bounce back. No, it's not. That will also change what the relationship is between employers and employees. So there'll be a lot more ability for employers to say, yeah, we're going to do this and that other kind of cost-cutting measure. It also could have a different effect, which is that people have to work from home, then they can't have both couples and a little kid all working on the kitchen table. So it indicates needing larger apartments. So it's very unclear, and I would not crystal ball that. I would say that there's multiple scenarios and different market segments in which that's going to work. My overall real estate concern really is that there are still 30 million people who just got unemployed in the United States, and how that percolates through is going to impact the employer relationship more than whether you have to have plastic over the salad bar.
Yeah, fair enough. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah. So in the short term, like again, timing is everything, and I know you wrote this book with a totally different focus in like the productivity, and while you're certainly looking at what's the possibility of a pandemic, how can we? What organizations, since you've written this book, do you think are really best practice? Who are you going to write your next case about, or who do you think has ticked a number of the boxes for creating the healthy building?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in there a minute just to, to say, look, we do wish the timing wasn't quite what it was. And our hope for the book is that it does offer a roadmap for how we can do things better as we come out of this sick building era and get to a better place in terms of how buildings can protect us and our health. John and I both really encouraged. There are some signals just in the past couple of months that many major organizations, multinationals, are pivoting towards healthy building strategies. In fact, calling it healthy buildings. Take a look around some of these websites. I don't want to call anybody out or highlight anybody, but you can look and see, even on earnings calls, people saying, we're all about healthy buildings. These are companies that hadn't mentioned the phrase healthy buildings. I'm not saying it's because of our book. It's because of what's happening in the world, and they're recognizing the importance of healthy indoor environments. So that was one of our goals. I think one of the challenges or the thing I was talking to my research team about this in the past 2 weeks is we really have to be vigilant about continuing to shape that narrative around what healthy buildings really are going forward. Mm-hmm. We had greenwashing happen. Will there be health washing? Probably. There's already some products on the market that are overstepping their claims of what it can and can't do. Mm-hmm. So we have a responsibility, all of us, John and I have responsibility, everyone who's listening to this, to say, no, we have to be sure we lead with the science and good practice. We think what we've done in the book is lay out an argument, laid out the science and laid out an argument for why this has to happen. And by the way, healthy buildings for all, right? We need a future where healthy buildings are the norm, not the exception. It's healthy buildings for all people in all aspects, in all sectors. Otherwise, it won't be a success. I have no interest in creating or helping people come up with a healthy building for one building in the middle of New York City. That's a failure. Mm-hmm. But I'm hopeful we can help shape it and kind of move this forward and help these companies that are jumping in the game bring some of that science that's in the book and help them shape this future.
Yeah. Well, the questions just keep rolling in, and we'll collect these for you, and hopefully they'll be helpful for you for writing more, because we're just not going to be able to get to all of them. But I just wanted to wrap up by thanking you and saying I particularly liked one of your chapter opening quotes by Ben Franklin, and it was, "I'm persuaded that no common air from without is so unwholesome as the air within a closed room that has been often breathed and not changed." So I thank you for breathing new air into this conversation that we realize it's just at the beginning, and that we all have a lot to learn. Obviously, all the answers aren't there, but we did put in the chat. I just wanted to remind people the 2 sessions that are probably a lot more technical than what we went into today for the participants. So I hope you can see that in the chat. And also, as Joe and John will say, it takes a village. So I also want to thank the amazing team from marketing and communications here at HBS, Ashley and Hensley, and from our amazing IT department who helped us produce this session, Brian and Nick and Lindsay. And then I have 2 cohorts in crime, Dina and Mariah, who helped me pull these sessions together. So we couldn't do it without them. The Books at Baker series, we're just planning the rest of the summer and the fall, so I don't have a next one to announce to you, but we keep that information on the Baker Library website. Also, you keep watching Working Knowledge, because we'll be doing some more, or we'll do some follow-up from Joe and John's work. If you haven't seen the HBR article or listen to the Cold Call podcast with Brian Kenny on the Tower for the People, these are all just great ways to, and right, then when you do have, go and read the book. And have a look at the book, because it really is a fascinating read. So I can't thank you enough for joining us. Do you have any last words to the wise that you'd like to leave the group with?
I guess I would thank you for having us and comment that there are a number of things happening in parallel at HBS. One is around the future of work, another is around post-COVID, and the third is around race. And Joe and I think that healthy buildings have a lot to do with health outcomes, and where people live and how their health turns out also correlates very strongly to race. So we think there's really an opportunity to not just be cliche, but really to create some shared value by looking at all three of those issues together.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, thanks, John. And the last thing I'll add too is, we didn't really talk about, in the book, we talk about health beyond the four walls. And so buildings influence our health, not just from the time indoors, but also in the decisions we make and resource consumption and energy. It's tied into the climate conversation. And so without exaggeration, really the decisions we make regarding our buildings now and going forward will determine our collective health for a long time. And so we can do a lot better there. And so thank you, Deb and the entire team, for having us on and giving us a chance to share some of the ideas in our book. I really appreciate it.
Well, we look forward to following your work and reading more about it. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing everyone at the next books at Baker. Bye for now.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.